Okay, have you got that?
Yep, we can see.
Lovely, thank you. And thanks again, Grace, for the introduction. And thank you, Ben, even though you're not here, because I think that sets a really useful foundation for what I certainly see as a growing sort of regulatory framework within which the games industry is operating. I'm going to talk very briefly about one small part of that framework, and it's the Age Appropriate Design Code, which you'll also see referred to as the Children's Code, which is its shorter, more informal name. So very briefly, I'm going to cover four things. What is it? What does it say? How does it apply to businesses in the interactive entertainment industry? Or what do those businesses need to do? So first of all, what is it? Well, it is a statutory code of practice. I'll come back to that. It's a code of practice published by the ICO, the UK data protection regulator. It has the worthy aim of protecting children online, applies to any business offering services in the UK that's likely to be accessed by children. So 2 points there. The first is it's not about where the business is located, it's about where the user is located. So even if a business is outside the UK, if the user's inside, then it will be covered. And as you can see, the words likely to be accessed by children are deliberately very broad. So that's going to cover most of the products and services that this industry puts out, and particularly given that by child, for these purposes, we're talking about anyone under the age of 18. This is already in force, but we're currently in a 12-month transition period to help businesses sort of prepare and get their house in order if need be. So it will become really live, if you like, on the 2nd of September this year. So what does it say? Well, it consists of 15 standards. And these standards, which we'll come on to in a moment, but they, if you like, they amplify, I would say, the principles that already exist in our good friend, the GDPR. So you'll be familiar with the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, which many of you have been through a big process to make sure you're compliant with the GDPR. Well, this code, if you like, just draws out some of these principles within it. It's not new law, it's, if you like, explaining how these principles of the GDPR are supposed to be applied. But it is more than just guidance. It is a statutory code, as I've mentioned. It's not just the ICO saying, okay, well, this is how we think the GDPR works within this arena. It's a code that the Commission will have to take into account when looking at businesses in the sector. It's a code that the courts will take into account. So it's more than just guidance, but it is not new law. So for example, Recital 38 of the GDPR sets out the general framework that businesses need to work to when it comes to children's data. They merit specific protection. They're less well aware of the risks, so on and so forth. And throughout the GDPR, there's a number of provisions that deal expressly with children and their data. The code, if you like, seeks to draw these together, or parts of these together, to help businesses to understand how the GDPR applies to children online. So I'm not going to go through all 15 standards, but what I thought would be helpful was just to draw out some of the key principles, if you like, that come out through the code. The first is what I've called high privacy settings. So as a default, privacy setting should be set to high, unless there is some compelling reason not to. And by compelling, we really do mean compelling. That's preventing crime, preventing child exploitation, and so forth. And businesses are told or are directed not to use nudge techniques to try to encourage children to weaken those settings or to share personal data. So that the bar is like set privacy settings high when it comes to children. The second principle, or an area of concern, if you like, for the ICO is geolocation. And there are obvious reasons for that concern with the protection of children, physical safety, etc. So as a default, geolocation settings should be switched to off, again, unless there's a compelling reason otherwise. And the third thing in relation to geolocation is it should be obvious to a child when their location is being tracked, and settings should be reverted to off when that session is over. So geolocation is a big area, particularly of course for mobile games. The third area is profiling. So by profiling, we're talking about making inferences based on automatically processed personal data. So that could be serving personalized advertising content. If it is essential to profile as part of the provision of the core service, then you get that setting to be on by default. But we have to have appropriate measures in place to protect children from harmful effects. So making sure that they're not served with content detrimental to their health or well-being. There should be separate privacy settings for each different type of profiling. So that's the third broad area of, if you like, that you need to look at. The fourth is transparency. So I think many of us are used to some rather lengthy and impenetrable privacy policies. I mean, that's not what we should be doing anyway, but particularly when it comes to children, the privacy information needs to be served in language that a child of the relevant age is going to be able to understand. And what the ICO recommends is that businesses provide what it calls bite-sized information about how data is used at the point when it's relevant. So, for example, when location tracking is on, there should be an easy understood pop-up explaining what will be tracked, for how long, etc. And then age-appropriate application. And this is, in a sense, one of the most tricky areas, because what a business needs to do is to tailor the safeguards it applies based on the age range of the audience. Now, for some, this will be simple in a sense they will know their audience is very young. For others, their audience may be very broad. And if you don't know what that range is, then you're going to have to apply the lowest common denominator and apply safeguards for children across your entire user database. So turning now to how does it apply to businesses in the interactive entertainment sector? Well, the first thing is, I think, is to make the point that it requires businesses to consider issues that on the face of it may not be directly related to privacy, such as screen breaks, general user welfare, such as nudge techniques. And this has led some to say that the code actually goes beyond the GDPR, even though the idea of it is just to, if you like, explain and help apply the GDPR. Well, I think if you look into the code and how it's meant to be understood, you can see how some of these areas interplay, but there are things that may not be obviously or immediately relevant to privacy, which actually do have a privacy application, such as nudge techniques in the context that I've already outlined and various other contexts. As I've also mentioned previously, I think if you're a mobile games business, there are some particular challenges given the substantial amount of data that is collected or can be collected, and particularly around sort of geolocation. The third issue or consideration is that where a business in the sector has a very broad range of ages across its user base, then it may need to start thinking about segmenting those different audiences and tailoring experiences appropriate for those different age ranges. Because it may not be appropriate or helpful to have a one-size-fits-all policy. You may be looking to serve slightly different content to someone aged 16 plus as opposed to someone aged 12 plus, rather than just having something that's going to be suitable for everyone. And that, I think, is quite a challenge for a number of businesses in the sector. I think for similar reasons, we'll see increasing age verification, which restricts games to over 18s. So as I mentioned, the code is there to apply to services, products likely to be accessed to children. So if you've got a rating of 18 and over, then you may say, well, actually, now we can only deal with people above that age. I think finally, there will be an increased focus on data sharing between developers, publishers, other third parties to ensure that that does in fact comply with the code and therefore the GDPR. So turning around to what do you need to do if you're a business in the sector, the first and most obvious thing is you need to assess whether the code applies to your businesses, how it applies, and minimize any data protection risks. And to do that, you'd be looking to complete one of these data protection impact assessments. Now, you will have been through this process as part of the GDPR. However, you may need to refresh, in fact, you will need to refresh your DPIA to make sure that in your assessment of the business in relation to the GDPR, that you have in fact covered everything that the code, if you like, highlights, comes out from the GDPR. You may want to review or introduce some new age-appropriate resources for your service. So as I mentioned, some businesses are looking to segment a game or game service for different ages, or indeed take themselves completely outside the realm of a child. Give children high default settings, high privacy settings by default, and also consider whether the data you're collecting is something you need or want in the first place. I mean, as a general principle, we should only be collecting the data we really do need and want, and don't want to be collecting anything more than that. I think there's going to be an increasing review of age verification mechanisms. Now, again, this is a really difficult area because there are no, if you like, bulletproof age verification mechanisms for children, at least. There are a number of different possibilities. The ICO has sort of set out a number of those in the guidance it's produced. I think what is necessary with this and the code as a whole is to take a risk-based approach. There isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to the code and children's data. It's what's right for your audience and your particular service, and therefore balancing that against sort of the relevant risks and appropriate safeguards you need to introduce. And finally, you need to be ready to prove compliance. Now, this is, again, not new territory. Under the GDPR, there's this principle of accountability. So businesses need to be able to demonstrate and evidence that they comply with the code, and that's complying both to technical and organizational level. The ICO has indicated it will start to actively carry out audits on businesses. And so what you need is a little audit trail to be able to show that you have applied your mind, as it were, to the standards set out in the code, and that you've made decisions in a reasonable way based on an evidence and proper risk-based approach. So if you're asked a question, why are you doing that, or why aren't you doing this, then you can say, oh yes, well, we have looked at this and the view we've taken is that because of these reasons, but you need to be doing that now. Now, I think there are, for many people, when they first looked at the code, they thought, oh no, look, we've just gone through this huge process in getting compliant with the GDPR, and now there's another piece of sort of like privacy legislation, as it were, or privacy obligations that are thrust upon us. As I say, this is not new law. It's almost a sort of a checklist to be able to assess whether you have indeed done the job you thought you did when becoming compliant with the GDPR. It's a principles-based code. It's not you must do this, you must do that. But if you use it as a checklist, the ICO would see the code as your friend. It's there to help you to check that you've complied with the GDPR and thought about all the things that you would want to think about anyway. The ICO is also doing its best, I think, to try to help businesses get compliant. It doesn't want to catch people out. It wants people to become compliant. You may have seen the ICO's Children's Code Hub with a variety of information and resources, and also a template DPIA to help you do the assessment that you're want to do if you haven't already done as part of compliance with the code. So as I say, you've got until the 2nd of September this year. Don't leave it to the last minute, but there's plenty of time to get your house in order if anything needs to be done. I think that's my 15 minutes up, so I shall end there. But